The sun had long dipped below the horizon, but the once thriving town was far from peaceful. Its ruins, covered by an almost eerie silence, stood as a testament to a history that had been deliberately buried. There was no plaque, no sign, no mention in any of the modern maps. It was as if the place had never existed. And yet, whispers still lingered. Whispers from those who were left behind. Whispers from those whose memories were clouded by the fog of time, but not erased. The place, forgotten by history, remained vivid in their minds. What had happened here? Why did everyone pretend that it was never there? Years passed and the local population moved on, but a few older souls who still dared to speak of it, continued to share hushed stories of a forgotten past. For them, it wasn't just a tragic event, it was a scar that never healed. The people who once lived here had been more than just a footnote in some dusty historical book. They were real and their lives mattered even though the rest of the world had decided to erase them. But for every whispered account, there was one question that no one seemed to answer. Why? Why had this place, this community, been silenced? Why had they been erased from memory? The town, long abandoned, was now little more than a shadow of its former self. The once bustling streets had grown over with creeping ivy and weeds. The buildings, though still standing, looked as though they had been left in a hurry, half-finished, as if someone had abruptly decided to walk away and never return. Even the cemetery, a final resting place for the families that had called this town home, seemed to be fading into obscurity. The gravestones were worn, many of the names indistinguishable. It was almost as if time itself was conspiring to erase every trace of this place's existence. But there were those who remembered. There were survivors, those who had either been too young to understand what had really happened or those who had lived in fear for so long that speaking up now felt like a betrayal. Still, some had dared to reach out to speak with outsiders. They shared fragments of memories, their voices trembling as they recalled the days when the place was still full of life. And they told stories that made your skin crawl. It all began decades ago when the town had been a thriving hub of activity, a place where families built their homes and established their futures. No one had expected it to end the way it did. In the beginning, it had been like any other town. People worked, children played, and the days blended together with an ordinary rhythm. But somewhere along the way something had gone wrong. A dark undercurrent had begun to seep into the community. Those who were perceptive enough, those who were paying attention, began to notice the strange behavior of certain individuals. Small rumors started circulating about the wealthy families who lived on the outskirts, those who kept to themselves. There were whispers about their involvement in something strange. No one could say for sure, but the air grew thick with suspicion. But the first real hint of something sinister came when people started disappearing. The disappearances were subtle at first, nothing that would raise alarm bells. A child here, a teenager there, people who left and never came back. At first, the families wrote it off as runaway cases or unfortunate accidents. The town had its share of misfits and troubled souls. But then it became harder to ignore. The disappearances continued. No bodies were found. No clues were left behind. It was as if the town was slowly being devoured by a force no one could understand. Soon, entire families vanished. One by one, houses were left empty, their doors left ajar, their windows wide open. The once bustling streets began to empty. Neighbors stopped seeing each other. And when they did, their conversations turned to whispers. There were rumors, of course. It was always easier to chalk it up to coincidence or bad luck. But deep down, the people of the town knew something far darker was at play. It wasn't long before the local authorities took notice. They came, they investigated, but found nothing. No evidence, no trace of the missing people. The town officials insisted it was all a misunderstanding, a collective panic that had caused people to leave, voluntarily or otherwise. But the community knew better. Something didn't feel right. And yet no one spoke up. Those who did were met with hostility, accusations of spreading unfounded fear. But even as the town grew emptier, more silent, there were still those who clung to the memory of what had been lost. Among them was one particular woman, Martha Clark, who had been a young girl when the disappearances began. She remembered the days when the town was alive with laughter and activity. Her family had lived just down the street from the town square, and she could recall the warmth of those summer evenings when children played outside until the sun went down. But all of that faded quickly. Martha's parents were among the first to vanish, leaving her behind with only a few relatives who also disappeared not long after. Martha, now an elderly woman, had lived with the memory of those days like a haunting shadow, always questioning what had happened, what she had missed. She spoke of a group of families that had always been at the center of the town's affairs. Respected families, wealthy and well-connected. They were the ones who controlled the town's businesses, who provided for its workers, and who made sure everything ran smoothly. But as Martha grew older, she began to hear rumors about them. Strange stories that didn't make sense. People who had vanished had been seen speaking to these families shortly before their disappearances. And even more chilling, some people claimed to have seen these families near the cemetery late at night, conducting rituals that were too bizarre to be anything but wrong. Martha, with the help of a few others who had managed to survive, had tried to uncover the truth, but it was always just out of reach. The more she dug, the more resistance she faced. Documents were burned. Files went missing. People who asked too many questions were told to mind their business, to stop spreading rumors. And when that didn't work, people simply disappeared. It became clear to her that someone wanted the town's past buried, truly buried, and they would stop at nothing to make sure the world forgot what had happened here. But no matter how much they tried to erase it, some stories couldn't be wiped away. Martha and the others continued to meet in secret, gathering what little they could, hoping that one day, someone would come looking for the truth. They would speak of the families, of the disappearances, of the strange ritualistic activities that had gone on under the cover of darkness. They spoke of the people who had been silenced, whose voices had been stolen. The town may have been forgotten by history, but its story, its tragedy, lived on in the minds of the few who refused to let it die. They were the last keepers of a secret too dark for the world to know. But they couldn't hold on forever. And as the years passed, the few who had carried the memories with them began to fade, taking the secrets of the town with them. And so, the place that no one spoke of, the place that had been erased from history, remained. Buried beneath layers of time, hidden in plain sight. Forgotten by all, except those few who dared to remember. But what if they were wrong? What if the true history was more disturbing than they could ever imagine? What if, after all these years, the secrets of this place were ready to resurface? In the years that followed, the town continued its slow decline into obscurity. The air, once filled with the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting, was now eerily silent. But there was still something about the place that tugged at the hearts of those who had lived there. The land, the buildings, and the very ground seemed to hold a secret, a hidden truth that refused to stay buried. It wasn't just the people who had vanished, it was everything about the town itself. Its very existence had been erased from the pages of history, like a scar hidden beneath layers of dirt. As the decades passed, only a few remained who dared to speak of it. Those who had grown up in the town, those who had known its residents before the disappearance, kept the memory alive, though they did so in whispers. They spoke of a time when things were different, when the streets were alive with the hum of commerce and the chatter of neighbors. They spoke of the market square, where families gathered to buy their food and share stories, of the small shops that lined the streets, each with its own unique charm. It was a place where people knew each other by name, where everyone had a role to play, and where life seemed simple, even idyllic. But that was before the change. Before the silence took over. It was hard for people outside of the town to understand. How could a place so vibrant and full of life simply vanish from the earth without a trace? How could a community that had once been so tightly woven fall apart so suddenly, so completely? Those who had lived there had their theories, but they had learned to keep them to themselves. Some said it was the fault of the wealthy families, the ones who had always seemed to hold a disproportionate amount of power. Others believed that the disappearances had something to do with the strange rituals that had been whispered about, the kind of things that people only dared speak of in hushed tones, late at night, when the fear of retribution was lower. Martha Clark, now in her later years, was one of the few who had witnessed it all. She had grown up in the town, a child full of hope and curiosity, surrounded by a close-knit community. She remembered the laughter, the warmth of family gatherings, and the sense of belonging that permeated the air. It was a time when she believed in the goodness of people, when she thought that the world was safe and predictable. But when the disappearances began, her innocence was shattered. The town was shaken to its core, and the people who had once been so welcoming and open grew wary. Neighbors stopped speaking to each other. People who had once been friendly now avoided one another, eyes darting nervously whenever they crossed paths. The streets, once full of activity, became empty. And the silence, oh the silence, settled over the town like a thick fog, suffocating everything in its wake. It wasn't just the people who had disappeared. It was the very spirit of the town. The energy, the life that had once flowed through its veins, was gone. Even the buildings seemed to sag under the weight of something unseen, something oppressive. The shops, once bustling with activity, stood abandoned, their windows covered in grime. The homes, which had once been filled with the sounds of families and laughter, now stood as empty shells, their doors swinging loosely on their hinges. Martha remembered when her parents, who had been among the first to vanish, had started acting differently. At first it was small things, her mother growing distant, her father becoming increasingly secretive, but then it escalated. The neighbors began to notice too. People stopped visiting, stopped asking about her family. Martha had been too young to understand at the time, but now, looking back, she could see the warning signs. Her parents had known something they hadn't shared with her. Something they couldn't share. And before she could ask any questions, before she could truly understand what was happening, they were gone. Vanished without a trace. Just like the others. It wasn't long after that when Martha started hearing the rumors. At first, they were just whispers, casual comments made in passing, easily dismissed as gossip. But as the years went on, the stories grew more disturbing. There were those who claimed to have seen strange figures in the night, moving through the streets under the cover of darkness. Others spoke of eerie lights seen near the old cemetery, flickering in the dead of night like the remnants of some forgotten ritual. Martha couldn't make sense of it. She didn't know what to believe. All she knew was that the town she had once known was no more, and the truth behind its destruction was a mystery that no one seemed willing to solve. In the years that followed, she tried to find answers. She went to the local library, scouring old records and newspaper clippings, but everything seemed to lead to a dead end. It was as if the town had never existed in the first place. The records were spotty, incomplete, and riddled with discrepancies. One by one, the people who might have known something passed away, leaving her with nothing but questions and unanswered fears. Martha had no answers, only a growing sense of dread that refused to leave her. It wasn't until she met Henry, a young historian who had come to town to research its history, that she began to find the pieces of the puzzle. Henry had heard the same stories, the same rumors that had plagued the town for years. He was intrigued by the mystery, fascinated by the idea that a town could simply disappear from history. So he came to investigate, hoping to find answers, hoping to uncover the truth. At first, Martha was skeptical. She had seen so many people come and go, all promising to uncover the truth, only to disappear into the same oblivion that had swallowed the town. But Henry was different. He was persistent, methodical, and above all, he was not afraid to ask the tough questions. Together, they began to piece together the fragments of the town's past. They interviewed the few remaining survivors who were reluctant to speak but eventually revealed bits of the truth, each account adding a new layer to the mystery. The more they dug, the more they realized that the story they were uncovering was far darker than they could have imagined. It wasn't just a random act of violence or a series of unfortunate events, it was something far more sinister. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the disappearances had been planned. It was as though the town had been deliberately targeted, wiped from the face of the earth. But who was behind it? And why? What had driven the powerful families, the ones who had controlled the town, to commit such atrocities? And who had helped them? Was it just a matter of greed, or was there something more? Something darker? Martha and Henry's investigation uncovered chilling details about the families who had once ruled the town. They had been wealthy, influential, and powerful, but beneath the surface there had been something more. The families had been involved in strange, occult practices, ones that were whispered about but never confirmed. There were rumors of rituals, of sacrifices, of dark deals made in the dead of night. It was said that these families had struck bargains with forces beyond human comprehension, seeking power and immortality in exchange for the lives of those they deemed expendable. As Martha and Henry delved deeper, they began to uncover evidence that the disappearances had been part of a larger, more elaborate plan. A plan that involved not just the destruction of the town, but the erasure of its very existence from the pages of history. The more they learned, the more they realized that the truth was far stranger and far more terrifying than they could have imagined. But even as they got closer to uncovering the full extent of the horror, they began to feel the weight of something ominous closing in on them. The closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous their investigation became. But despite the growing threats and the mounting danger, they couldn't stop. They couldn't walk away. They had to know what had really happened. What had the families done? And who had helped them? They had to uncover the full truth no matter the cost. For the sake of the town. For the sake of the lost souls who had vanished into the night. For the sake of the memory of a place that had been buried beneath time's unforgiving surface. And as they pressed on, they realized that the truth they were searching for was far more horrifying than anything they had ever imagined. The town's legacy wasn't just one of abandonment, it was one of dark, twisted secrets that had been hidden for decades. Secrets that had been buried so deep that even now, decades later, no one wanted to uncover them. The deeper Martha and Henry delved into the forgotten history of the town, the more they realized just how much had been hidden, intentionally erased from every known record. It wasn't just the disappearances that had been swept under the rug, it was the very fabric of the town's existence. The more they discovered, the more they came to understand that there had been a concerted effort to wipe this place off the map. No trace, no memory, nothing. It wasn't just an unfortunate series of events, it was a calculated, deliberate attempt to bury something darker, something more sinister than either of them could have ever imagined. At first, the puzzle pieces seemed to fit into a neat and tragic narrative. People vanished, families disappeared, and the once bustling streets were now empty. The town's economy had crumbled in the wake of these unexplained losses, leaving its residents destitute and desperate. But even as they pieced together the broad strokes of the town's demise, the details were elusive. Some things simply didn't make sense. Documents were missing. Dates didn't match up. Key figures in the town's history had left no trace behind, not even a death certificate. There were gaps in the timeline that couldn't be explained away. It was as if someone had intentionally removed all evidence of their involvement in the town's downfall. But why? Martha, who had lived through the darkest days of the town's history, was beginning to suspect that the true story was even darker than she had imagined. She had always suspected that the powerful families, those who controlled the town, were somehow involved. But what they had done, what they had been hiding, was more than she could have ever guessed. The pieces they were uncovering hinted at something far beyond just greed or political ambition. It was as if the families were involved in something far more nefarious, something that transcended earthly desires. The more they looked into the history of the wealthiest families, the more they uncovered strange, unsettling details. These families had not just controlled the town's commerce and politics, they had been involved in something far more secretive and disturbing. As they dug deeper into the archives, Henry found several references to strange gatherings, meetings that were held in the dead of night, far from prying eyes. These meetings were not about politics, not about business. They were about something much older, something far darker. There were mentions of rituals, of sacrifices made in the dead of night, of secret pacts made with unseen forces, forces that no one dared name. It was difficult to find solid evidence, as much of it had been deliberately hidden or destroyed. But they found enough, old journals, letters, and fragmented records, that hinted at a terrifying truth. The families of the town had been involved in occult practices, in dark rituals that promised power, wealth, and immortality. It was said that these rituals, though never fully understood, were believed to give those who participated control over life and death. They spoke of the manipulation of life forces, of ancient rites passed down through generations, each more grotesque than the last. Martha felt a growing sense of dread as the pieces began to fit together. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the disappearances were no accident. They weren't just random acts of violence or the result of some inexplicable tragedy. They were the result of something deliberate, something calculated. The families had been using the town as a sort of testing ground, a place to experiment with these dark arts. And when they had gotten too greedy, too bold, something had gone terribly wrong. The town, in essence, had been sacrificed, its people used as pawns in some twisted game of power and control. But even as the dark truth began to surface, there were more questions than answers. Martha and Henry's investigation revealed a chilling pattern of ritualistic behavior, but it was far from clear what had ultimately happened to the town. Was it the rituals themselves that had caused the town's downfall, or was there something more to it? Some unknown force at play? And who had been behind it all? The wealthy families had disappeared, their influence completely erased from history. Had they been punished for their sins, or had they simply vanished into the shadows, their legacy buried alongside the town? Martha felt the weight of the mystery bearing down on her. The truth, though terrifying, seemed just within reach, but it was elusive, slipping through her fingers every time she thought she had it. It wasn't just the town that had been erased, it was the very people involved in its destruction. The records, the documents, the very names of the powerful families who had controlled the town were gone. It was as if they had never existed. But why would anyone go to such lengths to cover up the truth? What was so terrible, so horrifying, that it had to be buried so deep? And why had no one ever spoken out? As the investigation continued, Martha began to suspect that the families hadn't acted alone. There were mentions of a secret society, a shadowy organization that seemed to be pulling the strings behind the scenes. This group was different from the wealthy families. They weren't concerned with wealth or power. They were concerned with something else, something far older and darker. They were said to be practitioners of an ancient, forbidden form of magic, one that dealt with the very fabric of life and death. and it was clear that this society had played a role in the destruction of the town. But who were they? And what did they want? Henry was beginning to share Martha's growing sense of unease. As they continued their research, they stumbled upon a hidden letter, one that seemed to have been deliberately overlooked, one that had somehow managed to survive the efforts to erase the town's history. The letter was old, its paper yellowed with age and its ink faded, but the words were unmistakable. It was a letter from one of the wealthy families, addressed to someone outside the town. The letter spoke of an agreement, a deal that had been struck between the families and the mysterious society. It was clear from the letter that the families had been seeking something far beyond wealth or power. They had been seeking immortality. But there was more. The letter also mentioned a ritual that would require the sacrifice of the town itself. The families had agreed to offer up the lives of their people in exchange for the promise of eternal life. They had believed that by doing so, they would be granted the power to control not only life and death, but time itself. And so, the town had become a playground for their dark experiments, a place where the line between life and death had been blurred beyond recognition. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the town had never been a community in the traditional sense. It had been a breeding ground for the dark ambitions of the wealthy, a place where they had conducted unspeakable rituals, a place where the forces of life and death were twisted and warped beyond comprehension. And in the end, the town had paid the price for their greed. But the true horror was still to come. As Martha and Henry pieced together the fragments of the town's history, they began to realize that the families hadn't just vanished. They had been part of something far larger, something far older. The town was just one piece of a much greater puzzle, a puzzle that stretched across time and space, touching every corner of the earth. The family's quest for immortality had led them to uncover something that no one was meant to know, a force that was older than humanity itself. And as they drew closer to the truth, Martha and Henry began to feel the presence of something watching them, following them, waiting for them. They couldn't see it, but they could feel it, lurking just beyond the edges of their understanding. The deeper they went, the more they realized that this was no longer just about a forgotten town or the people who had once lived there. It was about something far more dangerous, far more ancient, something that would stop at nothing to keep its secrets hidden. Something that would make sure they never got too close to the truth. As the investigation continued to unearth disturbing revelations about the town's lost history, Martha and Henry found themselves navigating through a labyrinth of half-truths, lies, and unsolved mysteries. Their journey into the town's dark past had turned from a search for answers into a dangerous pursuit of something far beyond their comprehension. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that this wasn't just a local conspiracy, it was part of something much larger, something that stretched its tentacles deep into the fabric of history itself. And yet, the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. Martha had always known that the town's past held dark secrets, but she hadn't truly understood the scope of those secrets until she and Henry started putting the pieces together. The families who had controlled the town had not only been involved in dark rituals and occult practices, but they had also sought to manipulate forces that were far older than anything human beings could comprehend. These were forces that bent the very laws of nature and time to their will. Forces that had been buried for centuries, hidden from view by those who understood their power and feared the consequences of revealing them. Every new discovery brought them closer to an uncomfortable truth. The families had been part of a larger network, a network of powerful individuals who shared the same dark ambitions. These individuals were connected by a secret society, one that had existed in the shadows for centuries. Its members were bound together by an ancient pact, a pact that promised them power, immortality, and dominion over life and death. But the price of this power had been steep. The society's members were bound by blood and ritual, and they had sacrificed not only their own morality but the very essence of humanity in exchange for the dark knowledge they sought. For Martha and Henry, the stakes were rising. They were no longer just uncovering the history of a forgotten town, they were entangled in a mystery that involved forces far beyond their understanding. It became clear that they were getting too close to something that some people or some entity did not want uncovered. At first, it was small things, strange phone calls in the middle of the night, unsettling messages left at their doorsteps, and anonymous warnings from people who seemed to know far too much. But soon, those warnings turned into something more ominous. One night, after returning from another long day of research, Martha found her house broken into. It wasn't just a typical robbery, nothing of value was taken. Instead, the intruders had gone through her papers, her notebooks, and her computer. They had torn through everything as though they were searching for something specific. But the most chilling part was what they left behind, a single symbol drawn in red on the floor of her living room. It was a symbol she had seen before, one that had appeared in the old journals they had uncovered during their investigation. A symbol tied to the secret society, a mark of those who had made the pact, a sign of those who wielded the dark powers. Henry had been equally targeted. His apartment was ransacked in a similar fashion, and the only thing left behind was a note, written in a cryptic, almost indecipherable script, that read, "The truth has its price. Are you willing to pay it?" The note was signed with the same symbol. It was clear that someone, or something, was warning them to stop. But neither of them was willing to back down. The more they were threatened, the more determined they became to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But with each step forward, the danger grew more intense. The deeper they went, the more they felt the presence of something watching them, something that had always been there, lurking just beyond their perception. The walls seemed to close in, the air felt thicker, and the shadows seemed to move in ways that defied logic. The line between reality and nightmare was beginning to blur, and Martha felt a creeping sense of dread that she couldn't shake. Every corner they turned, every piece of evidence they uncovered, seemed to lead them closer to something far more terrifying than they could have imagined. One night, as they were poring over old maps and documents in the library, they stumbled upon a hidden reference to a place that had never been recorded before. It wasn't on any of the town's official maps, and no one had ever spoken of it. The map was old, its edges frayed and stained with time, but it depicted an area deep within the surrounding forest, a place that seemed to have been deliberately excluded from all known records. The location was marked by the same symbol they had seen repeatedly, one that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. This map led them to a hidden chamber beneath the town, a chamber that had been buried for centuries. It was a place where the families and their secret society had conducted their most dangerous rituals, a place where they had summoned the dark forces they sought to control. As Martha and Henry ventured deeper into the bowels of the earth, they began to feel the weight of the past pressing down on them. The air grew colder, the atmosphere heavier, and the very walls seemed to breathe with a malevolent energy. When they finally reached the heart of the chamber, they discovered a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The chamber was filled with ancient symbols, etched into the walls in a language neither of them recognized. In the center of the room was an altar stained with the remnants of long-forgotten rituals. The altar was surrounded by a circle of stone, each stone inscribed with the same symbol they had seen so many times before. The walls were covered in murals that depicted scenes of dark ceremonies, of sacrifices, and of the manipulation of life and death. It was a place where the veil between the living and the dead had been torn asunder, where the very forces of existence had been bent to the will of those who had sought immortality at any cost. The most chilling discovery, however, was what they found beneath the altar. It was a grave that had been sealed for centuries. But now the seal was broken. And as they pried open the ancient stone, they found something that sent a shiver down their spines, a body. But it was not just any body. It was preserved, unnaturally so, as if the body had been kept in some kind of suspended animation. And when they looked closer, they realized with horror that the body was not that of a human being. It was something else, something not quite alive, not quite dead, something that had been created, perhaps, in one of the rituals they had uncovered. Martha and Henry realized with growing dread that the society's search for immortality had not only involved manipulating life and death but had also involved creating new life, life that could be controlled, life that could be bent to their will. This creature, this abomination, was the result of their twisted experiments. And it was clear that the families hadn't just disappeared, they had been consumed by the very forces they had sought to control. They had become part of the darkness they had unleashed, trapped in a cycle of death and rebirth, unable to escape the consequences of their greed. As the weight of this discovery settled over them, Martha and Henry knew that their investigation had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were no longer just uncovering a dark chapter in history, they were now part of something far greater, something far more dangerous. The forces they had awakened were not going to let them walk away. They had uncovered the truth, but in doing so they had sealed their own fate. The shadow that had haunted the town for centuries was now aware of them, and it would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. Martha and Henry were no longer just fighting for answers, they were fighting for their lives. The silence in the chamber was deafening, as though the very walls themselves were holding their breath. Martha and Henry stood frozen, staring down at the grotesque body that lay beneath the altar. They could feel the air around them thickening, almost as if the room was alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to leave the chamber and never look back. But they couldn't. They were too deep into the mystery now. They had come this far, and the truth they had uncovered, horrifying as it was only the beginning. The creature before them was unlike anything they had ever seen. Its form was twisted and contorted, as though it had been shaped by forces that defied nature. The skin, where it was still intact, was a pale, sickly gray, stretched tight across bones that seemed too large for its frame. Its eyes, or what remained of them, were sunken and hollow, as if the very life force had been drained from them long ago. And yet, there was something about it that suggested it was not fully dead, not fully alive. It was as if it existed in a state between worlds, a prisoner of the dark rituals that had been performed in this very chamber. Henry, his face pale and his voice trembling, took a step back. This is what they were trying to create. They didn't just seek immortality. They sought to transcend death itself. This is the result. He paused, his eyes scanning the rest of the room. It's a hybrid. A creature born of the rituals they performed here. A creature that's not meant to exist in this world. Martha felt a cold chill wash over her. The creature before them was an abomination, a testament to the dark desires of the families who had controlled the town. They had sought power, control over life and death, and in doing so, they had unleashed something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The creature in front of them was the product of their arrogance, the culmination of their greed. But it wasn't just the creature that terrified Martha. It was the realization of how deeply the society's influence had penetrated not only the town's history but the very fabric of time itself. They hadn't just been playing with life, they had been toying with the fundamental laws that governed existence. They had discovered something ancient, something forgotten by the world, and they had tried to control it. But the forces they had tampered with were too powerful, too unpredictable. And now, it seemed, those forces had turned against them. Martha's thoughts were interrupted by a low, guttural sound coming from the creature. It wasn't a scream or a cry, it was something deeper, something more primal. It sounded almost like a warning. The creature's body twitched, its skeletal fingers curling into a claw as though it were trying to break free from its grave. The air in the room grew colder, and Martha could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Henry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I don't think it's completely dead." Henry's eyes widened with horror as the creature's movements grew more erratic. Its lips parted, revealing sharp, uneven teeth that looked more like those of a predator than a human. Its breath, if it could be called that, came in short, ragged gasps, as though it were fighting to stay alive, fighting to escape its confinement. "We need to leave. Now." Henry's voice was urgent, panicked. But Martha didn't move. She couldn't. The creature's presence, even in its decayed state, seemed to hold her in place, like an invisible force was wrapping around her, drawing her closer. She wanted to run, to escape, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Her mind raced, her thoughts spinning. This creature, this thing, was not just a casualty of the society's experiments. It was a warning. A manifestation of everything the families had sought to control, everything they had hoped to manipulate. They had unleashed something ancient, something that no human had the right to tamper with. And now, it seemed, that same power was beginning to stir again. The air in the chamber felt suffocating. The walls, etched with ancient symbols, seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own, as if the very stone was alive, responding to the awakening of the creature. Martha's heart raced as the room seemed to close in around her. The darkness, once merely a backdrop to their investigation, now seemed to come alive, swallowing the light, amplifying their fear. "We have to destroy it," Henry said, his voice cracking as he backed away slowly. "If we leave it here, it will." But before he could finish his thought, the creature let out a low, rasping hiss. Its body shifted unnaturally, its limbs twitching and jerking as it began to rise from the ground. The air around them thickened with an unbearable sense of dread, the ground vibrating beneath their feet. Martha could feel the floor beneath her shift, as though the entire chamber was alive, reacting to the creature's movements. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the symbols on them beginning to glow faintly as though they were coming to life. Panic surged through Martha's veins. This wasn't just a creature. It was the result of something far more powerful than anything they had anticipated. It was a force, an ancient force, that had been trapped beneath the town for centuries, waiting for the right moment to break free. And now it was waking up. "We have to get out of here. Now," Henry said again, his voice trembling with fear. But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber. Heavy, deliberate steps. Martha's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. They turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. A tall, cloaked figure, its face hidden beneath a hood. The figure moved with a confidence that suggested it had been waiting for them, watching them every step of the way. And in that moment, Martha realized with a sinking feeling that they were not just dealing with a creature born of dark rituals, they were dealing with someone who had orchestrated it all. The figure stepped forward, its cloak trailing behind it like a shadow, and as it did, Martha and Henry instinctively stepped back. The figure's voice was low, almost soothing, but it carried an unsettling authority that made the hair on the back of Martha's neck stand on end. "You've come too far," the figure said, its voice cold and measured. "You should have stopped before you uncovered the truth. Now you will have to pay the price." Martha's mind raced. This was no ordinary person. This was someone who knew the truth about the town, about the society, about the creature, and who had been part of the dark legacy that had been left behind. But who was this person? And why had they allowed Martha and Henry to get so close to the truth? The figure lifted a hand, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble once more. The air grew heavier, colder, as if the very force of nature was bending to the will of the person before them. Martha could feel the power radiating from the figure, an almost palpable force that threatened to crush them. "Who are you?" Henry demanded, his voice shaking but defiant. "What do you want?" The figure smiled, a cruel smile that sent a chill through Martha's spine. "What do I want? I want what was promised. I want the power. And now I will take it back." Before they could react, the figure raised its other hand, and in that instant the chamber erupted into chaos. The ground shook violently, and the symbols on the walls flared with an intense, blinding light. The creature on the altar stirred violently, its skeletal form lurching forward with unnatural speed. Martha and Henry were thrown to the ground, the air around them crackling with energy, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Martha's vision blurred, her body shaking uncontrollably as she struggled to regain her bearings. But the figure was gone, vanishing into the shadows, leaving only the chaos and the terrifying sound of the creature's hissing breath behind. She and Henry were alone, but they knew with terrifying certainty that this was only the beginning. The truth they had uncovered had awakened something ancient. Something that no one, not even the families who had summoned it, could control. And now it was free. The world outside the chamber had become unrecognizable. Martha and Henry stumbled through the forest, disoriented and breathless, their minds struggling to process everything that had just transpired. The air felt oppressive, as though the very sky above them was pressing down, heavy with the weight of an ancient and unfathomable power. It was as if the earth itself was waking up, shaking off centuries of slumber. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift unnaturally, and the trees around them appeared to whisper in the wind, their branches stretching like fingers, reaching out, closing in. Their escape from the chamber had been chaotic, a desperate sprint toward the unknown, guided only by fear and instinct. Every step they took seemed to draw them deeper into the forest, further from the town, further from the terrifying truth they had uncovered. But no matter how fast they ran, the feeling of being hunted never left them. It was as if something was following them, something that was aware of every movement, every breath they took. Every time they glanced over their shoulders, they could almost feel it, a presence lurking in the shadows just out of sight but always there. The silence that enveloped the forest was unnatural. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no animal calls. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for what, Martha couldn't say. But she could feel it, deep in her bones, the heavy, suffocating weight of something ancient, something forgotten, something that had been disturbed by their meddling. The truth they had uncovered was no longer just a mystery. It was a force, a living, breathing entity that was far more powerful than either of them had anticipated. Martha's heart pounded in her chest as the memories of the chamber flooded back to her. The creature, its body half dead yet still stirring with a malevolent energy. The hooded figure, speaking with a voice that seemed to echo in the very air around them. The terrifying realization that they had been manipulated from the start, that their investigation had been nothing more than a path leading them to this moment. It was all connected. The disappearances, the destruction of the town, the creation of the creature, it was all part of a larger, more terrifying plan. She glanced at Henry, who was struggling to keep up, his face pale and drawn with fear. His eyes were wide with panic, his breathing shallow, but there was something else there too, something darker, a glimmer of understanding, of resignation. He knew that they had stumbled upon something that they were never meant to find, something that was bigger than them, something that could never be undone. "We need to get out of here," Martha gasped, her voice strained. "We have to leave this place. It's not safe." Henry nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the darkening woods ahead. "We can't leave. Not yet. Not until we know what that thing was. We have to finish this." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Martha wasn't sure if she agreed with him. She wanted to run, to leave everything behind. She wanted to forget the horrors they had uncovered, to return to the life she had known before the darkness of the town had swallowed her whole. But she couldn't. The truth they had unearthed had become a part of her, and no matter how much she wanted to escape, she couldn't ignore the knowledge that now haunted her every waking moment. "What if we can't stop it?" she whispered, more to herself than to Henry. "What if we're not strong enough?" Henry's voice was low, almost distant as he responded, "It's not about strength. It's about stopping what's already been set in motion. Whatever that thing is, whatever we woke up in that chamber, it's part of something much bigger. We have to finish what we started." His words gave her no comfort. If anything, they only deepened the sense of dread that had been gnawing at her inside since they first uncovered the town's buried secrets. She couldn't shake the image of the creature, its hollow eyes staring into hers, as though it knew her fears, knew everything she had ever tried to forget. And the figure who had spoken to them in the chamber, had been clear: "You've come too far." It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. A threat. But they couldn't stop now. They had to press on, even if it meant confronting the forces that had been hidden for centuries, even if it meant facing the unimaginable horrors that lay ahead. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, reaching for them like hands. The wind whispered in their ears, and Martha thought she could hear voices in the distance, faint and indistinct, calling to her from the shadows. Her heart raced faster with each step. She tried to focus on the path ahead, but the forest was becoming more oppressive with every passing moment. It was as though the very land was shifting, reacting to their presence. They were no longer just walking through the woods, they were walking through something alive, something that resented their intrusion. And then, just when it seemed as though the forest would swallow them whole, they reached the clearing. It was sudden, almost disorienting, as if the forest had parted just for them. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the area. The clearing was small, circular, and surrounded by trees that seemed to bend inwards as if keeping watch. At the center of the clearing was a stone well, ancient and worn, its surface covered in moss and ivy. It looked like any other well, yet something about it felt wrong, something about it felt familiar. Martha stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted, as though the very air around her had thickened. The feeling was unmistakable. This place, this clearing, was part of the town's dark past. It had been here all along, waiting, hidden in plain sight. Henry stepped forward, his eyes wide with realization. "This is it," he said, his voice trembling. "This is where it all started." Martha's heart skipped a beat. The well. The symbol. It all made sense now. The well wasn't just a source of water. It was a conduit, a portal, something that connected the earthly realm to whatever ancient force the families had been trying to control. They had used it, perhaps unknowingly, as a focal point for their rituals, a place where life and death could be manipulated. "This is where they," Martha began, but her voice faltered as the ground beneath them began to tremble. It wasn't just a subtle shift this time. The earth was vibrating violently, shaking the trees, cracking the ground. The air grew thick with an unnatural energy, and the whispering voices from the shadows grew louder, clearer. It was as though the entire forest was waking up, responding to the disturbance. From the depths of the well came a low, guttural sound, a noise that seemed to vibrate in the very core of their beings. It was the same noise they had heard in the chamber, the same noise that had come from the creature. Only now it was louder, more pronounced, as though the creature was not alone. Something was rising. "Henry, we have to get out of here," Martha shouted, fear clawing at her chest. But Henry didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the well, and Martha followed his gaze. From the depths of the well, a dark figure began to emerge. It was a shape at first, a shadow twisting and shifting, slowly rising from the darkness below. And then, as it broke the surface of the well, it became clear. The creature wasn't alone. The well had been the prison, not just for one entity but for many. As the shadow grew taller, Martha realized that this was the true power they had awakened. A legion of dark, forgotten forces, bound together by a pact that had lasted for centuries. Forces that had been waiting, watching, and now they were free. The ground beneath them quaked once more as the figures began to rise from the well, their forms taking shape, like ancient spirits called back from the grave. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies twisted and decayed, but there was a hunger in them. A hunger that would not be satisfied until the world itself was consumed. The ground beneath Martha and Henry's feet cracked wide open as the first of the dark figures fully emerged from the well, its form twisting and pulsing with a malevolent energy. The air grew thick with an unnatural, suffocating presence, as if the very atmosphere was charged with a power older than the earth itself. Martha could feel the ground vibrating beneath her, the tremors spreading like ripples through water, reverberating deep into her bones. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer force of the horror unfolding before her. Every instinct told her to flee, but there was nowhere to run. The forest had closed in, the clearing had turned into a prison, and the air itself seemed to conspire against their escape. Henry stood beside her, frozen as well, his eyes wide with terror as the dark figures continued to rise from the depths of the well. Each shadowy form that emerged was twisted and distorted, as though it had been forged from nightmares. Their skin was slick with a dark oily sheen, their limbs unnaturally long and contorted, and their eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with an otherworldly light, empty yet filled with a thirst that no living being could understand. These were not just spirits, not merely ancient beings, they were something far worse. They were the embodiment of the darkness the families had sought to control, creatures born from a pact made with forces beyond comprehension. Martha's heart raced in her chest, and she could feel the blood drain from her face. Her thoughts were a blur, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what was happening. This was no longer just about the town's forgotten history, or the twisted rituals of the families who had ruled it. This was about something much older, something that had been waiting for centuries, buried deep beneath the earth, until it was disturbed by their reckless search for answers. They had uncovered the doorway to something ancient, something powerful, something that had lain dormant for eons. And now the doors had been thrown wide open. As more of the figures emerged from the well, Martha could see that they were not alone. The air around them seemed to shimmer, distorting with an eerie, almost liquid quality, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. The ground itself groaned, as though the earth was rejecting the intrusion, but the power that rose from the well was unstoppable. The figures reached out with long, clawed hands, their movements deliberate, slow but full of malice. It was as if they were savoring the moment, relishing in the fear they instilled. Martha felt the cold tendrils of fear creeping into her veins, but her mind was still racing, trying to process what was happening. The families, the occult rituals, the creature they had uncovered in the chamber, all of it was part of a larger, more terrifying plan. The power the families had tried to control, the darkness they had sought to bend to their will, had not only been uncontrollable, it had been waiting, biding its time. And now it was awake, and it was angry. "We have to stop them," Henry whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. But his words felt hollow, the weight of the situation too much to bear. There was no way to fight these creatures, no weapon that could hold back the forces they had unleashed. Whatever these beings were, they were beyond the realm of mortal comprehension. They were older than anything they could imagine, and they had no place in the world of the living. Martha nodded, though she knew that whatever they did now, it might be too late. They couldn't stop what had already begun. But they had to try. They had to find a way to shut the well, to put the creatures back where they had come from before the entire town, and perhaps even the world, was consumed by this ancient power. But as she turned to speak to Henry, she felt a sharp, sudden pressure in the air, a wave of force that nearly knocked her off her feet. The ground shook violently, and the trees around them began to bend, their branches creaking as if being pulled by an invisible force. The figures emerging from the well now stood fully upright, towering over them, their forms impossibly tall, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods that seemed to absorb the light. The air crackled with dark energy, and for the first time, Martha understood the true nature of the creatures before them. They were not mere spirits or shadowy figures, they were gods. Dark, forgotten gods. And they were hungry. The first figure reached out with a hand that stretched impossibly long, its fingers curling into claws, sharp and deadly. Henry cried out, stepping back, but it was too late. The creature's hand shot forward with blinding speed, its claws sinking into the air itself, ripping through the fabric of reality like paper. The air around them seemed to bend and snap, as if the very universe was struggling to hold itself together under the weight of the creature's power. Martha felt the temperature drop suddenly, a bone-chilling cold sweeping through the clearing. Her breath came out in sharp, visible gasps, and her body trembled violently as the darkness around them thickened. The creature's grip on the air tightened, and the very earth beneath them seemed to crack, the ground breaking apart in jagged, unnatural lines. The forest groaned, its ancient trees creaking under the pressure, and the shadows that had once been benign seemed to come alive, reaching out like tendrils, grasping at the very light itself. Then with a sudden force the creature's claws pierced the veil that separated the living from the dead. Martha felt her body freeze as she was pulled toward it, an invisible force drawing her in. Her chest tightened as if she were being crushed by a heavy weight. She could feel her heart pounding in her ears, the overwhelming pressure of the darkness closing in. But Henry, despite the terror gripping him, acted without hesitation. He grabbed Martha's arm, yanking her away from the creature's grasp just as its claws slashed through the air where she had stood. He pulled her toward the edge of the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with panic. "Come on. We have to move," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the dark creatures. Martha stumbled alongside him, her mind reeling. The creature's touch, she could still feel the pressure, the unnatural cold of it, as though it had reached into her very soul. And yet, even as they ran, she could feel its gaze following them, a weight pressing down on them, like the eye of a great storm. There was no escape. They were too far gone. As they ran through the forest, the creatures were no longer the only thing they had to worry about. The very ground beneath them seemed to tremble with every step they took, as if the earth itself was buckling under the weight of the evil they had unleashed. The trees around them bent and groaned, their trunks twisting unnaturally, as if they were being pulled by some unseen force. The wind howled through the forest, carrying with it a chilling voice, an ancient whisper that seemed to be calling their names. And then, in a moment of clarity, Martha realized what had to be done. The well, it was the source of the darkness, the doorway that had allowed the creatures to break free. If they could seal it, if they could somehow close the portal, they might stand a chance. But how? The creatures were too powerful, and the well itself was nothing more than a conduit to the forces that lay beyond. There was no simple way to stop this. But there had to be a way. There had to be. "Martha!" Henry shouted, snapping her out of her thoughts. She turned to see him pointing toward the distance, where the town once stood, now barely visible in the moonlight. "It's not over. They're coming for the town." The realization hit her like a freight train. The town, everything they had fought for, everything they had uncovered, was in danger. The creatures were not just confined to this clearing. They were coming for the town. For everyone. "No," Martha whispered, but she knew it was true. She had known all along deep in her gut that this was only the beginning. And now there was no turning back. "Come on," Henry urged again, his voice tinged with desperation. "We have to warn them. We have to stop this before it's too late." Together they ran toward the town, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were not just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for the very soul of the world itself.